let me show you an example of how actually a very, 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 very abstract work on complexity can surprisingly, even for us, have a yield detailed and even quantitative information about a real astrobiological context. This work, we've been developing it for the last 2 years, and we just sent it to publish like, I don't know, 2 weeks ago. So we'll see what happens with it. Okay. Going back to this astrobiology strategy of NASA, there was another question, which was, what can we learn about the evolution of early life from artificial life? And actually, in the last 20 years, the artificial life based on digital organisms, I will say now what that means, has been very intensively developed, especially from 2000 to 2005. It was like a very hot topic, and several Natures and Sciences were published about this subject. A digital organism can be many things, but imagine the best way to see it is to think that it is like a program, like a computer program that can do things. So it has all the properties of a real organism, but it has no chemistry in some sense. They are actually computational models, and all mutations, reproduction, competitions, everything is fixed by external rules. And in my opinion, and that's why I don't like them, I will tell you later, I want things to appear I want things to emerge in a natural way. The first digital organism, and in my opinion, it's the most important one, and its influence has been huge. It is very, very nice, and I really, really, really recommend you all to look at that, even in the Wikipedia, is the Conway's Game of Life. Very small. This is like a 2-dimensional array where very small, they're not even nodes, they are like small squares, can interact with very, very simple rules, and actually it can work forever, okay? It's the most basic stuff that you can imagine, but a huge and very complex pattern, different patterns appear, and they have been studied for the last 50 years. In 1990, in Cornwall, some researchers started to, and it was a very bright idea, started to study the competition between files, between programs that would try to get the control of a computer, in the sense that the faster you work, the more memory you control. So they would fight for the memory of the system. In Tierra, 1 year later, they start to put mutations in the codes. So you have a code which fights against another code to try to these files try to copy them as fast as possible, but sometimes they suffer mutations. And a mutation means that you change one line by another one in a very, very controlled way to make it work. Because I mean, anyone who has ever written a code knows that if you commit a mistake, if you put A where it should be B, the system is not going to work. That never happens. But in this case, these things were quite controlled. But finally, really, the digital organism that really has changed our way of facing computational biology has been AVIDA, that for the last 30 years has been used thousands of times to describe how mainly bacteria work, but many other systems too. And it was very finely, and many people have used it. The point is that, as I told you, reproduction, mutations, everything is controlled by these programs. And what I want to do is to try to find a system where these quantities, mutations, reproduction, competition, emerges, as I said, naturally. Okay, let's see if we are able to do that. What we propose here is NetWorld. NetWorld is a computational framework where we model the evolution of very simple networked structures. Actually, we start with isolated nodes, like isolated atoms, if you want. These networks represent chemical compounds, very simple chemical compounds that they interact with following very simple rules. These rules have nothing to do with chemistry, okay? We're going to show that there's like a drastic transition towards complexity, but all this is done from the point of view of complex networks. So there is no chemistry there, there's no astrobiology there, but surprisingly, we'll see that this transition to complexity is very similar to the emergence of molecular complexity in interstellar clouds. You know, in these clouds that you can find in interstellar medium and where the bricks of life are created before falling into the Earth and filling it with these little bricks that later will be used by prebiotic chemistry to give rise to life. Okay, I don't want to drive you crazy giving you explaining you how this works, but in very three basic ideas. We start with always n means 20, 30, 40 isolated nodes. So we don't start with networks. We study with nodes in the sense that it's like the origin of life, if you want. No? These n nodes interact in a very simple way just to organize more complex structures. And these complex structures, all of them can be divided following this probability, which only depends on the stability. Mu is the stability of each network, and beta, forget mu, beta is important. Beta is what we call the environment parameter, in the sense that a different environment means a different beta. So our system is so simple that has only one main parameter, which tells us whether we are studying, I don't know, a molecular cloud, or we are in the sea or wherever, okay? So all the physicochemical properties of the environment, temperature, radiation, interstellar dust, whatever you want, are condensed in beta. Different beta, different environment, all right? In a very simple way, what does this work? How does this work? If we start with 4 different nodes, 2 are chosen randomly. They might get connected or not, depending on whether both of them win in some quantity, which has to do with their importance inside the network. And so they can go down to have 2 pairs. I think I can go there to have 3 in a row. And after a while, because this is stochastic, we will arrive to this structure, perhaps, or perhaps to a different structure. It could be also, I don't know, like a square, and we stop there. This is the simplest system. Sometimes, actually, we get to a system that instead of stopping, keeps on moving in a cycle. Okay, so we get 2 structures that one becomes the other one, and then you go back. This is very similar to what, for example, RNA does, because I don't know, I'm sure that most of you know that an RNA sequence can fold in different structures. And sometimes one structure opens and then it closes in a different structure. This is very similar to us. So we also have this kind of cycles. All right. So in practice, what do we have? In practice, we have, imagine that we start here with 20 nodes. These are the number of networks. Okay. We suppose that each independent piece is a network. We have 20 nodes. They start to interact. They start to create small pairs, triangles, things like that. And then suddenly we find some complexity, which is destroyed, because I remind you that all structures can connect to grow and to become bigger, but they can also split in two pieces or more. So it's like what we have created here is a chemistry of networks, okay? And finally, we reach a big complex network, in this case of size 20, because we only have 20 nodes, and we stop there. So in this beta, in this environment, we will repeat this thousands of times, and we get an average of the different structures that have appeared, which these different structures are our diversity, our biodiversity, if you want, and the abundance of each structure is the probability of finding it in all this time. So if one structure appears more times than the others, then this one is more abundant. As you can see, we are using a very ecological point of view for this system. All right. We have studied this artificial chemistry and how our system creates very different structures depending on beta, depending on the environment. But let me just focus on two ideas. The first one is that, well, for small betas, we are always destroying the networks that we create. So we don't have really diversity. For small betas, look at this, the size of the networks that we create, even if we start with 40 nodes, are only 2, 3, 4 nodes, okay? But if beta grows, if we have a different environment which is not so harsh, where networks can grow and interact, then we start to have very different networks with very different sizes. Each blue node, by the way, is a different network. With complexity, H means complexity, we have more or less the same. If we have a very large beta, that is, if we let the system interact and grow, we have both very simple networks and very complex networks. But what I want to show you is, please look at this picture to the left. The number of configurations, the number of different networks that we can create for each different environment. Look at that. For small betas, we have like 3, 4, 7, up to 10 or 12 different bricks of life, if you want. For a small star, 3 in a row, things like that. But something happens in 1.5 that the number of networks starts to grow exponentially fast. And for 2, we have already like 200. And for 2.5, we had like 1,000. And from 2.8, we have around 10,000. So something happens in 1.5. The nodes, the small bricks that are created for small beta, if you cross this limit, starts to be able to interact in a very, very, very creative way. And so we have like a real explosion of biodiversity, well, of network diversity, if you want. If you look at it from the point of view of abundance, we also can find this change. For example, this transition. If we look at the normalized entropy, which is like a measure of the complexity of the system, we see that again at 1.5, this growth of complexity completely changes. So something happens there. Here, up to the left in A, what we're showing is the abundance of each of the nodes, of each of the structures. Of course, the most, depending on beta, depending on the environment. Of course, the most abundant one is the nodes that are alone, and then this one, and then this one, and then this one. But then after 1.5, we start to have lots, hundreds, thousands of different structures that appear and are quite abundant too. Not only that, in case there are physicists in the audience, if we paint the abundance, or also ecologists, the abundance of the different structures for each of the environments, depending on, and we paint it in a rank. So this is the abundance of the most abundant one, the abundance of the second one, the third one, the fourth one. We can see that for low betas, these curves are exponential, which is typical of ecology in systems that are very harsh, where it's very, very difficult to grow. However, when beta grows, when most created compounds are stable and we don't try to destroy them all, these curves that start to be exponential become power law, which are lines in a log curve, which means that there's like a qualitative change of behavior, okay? So it took us a long time to understand all this universe we have created, but you can of course ask, hey man, it's getting late. Where is the connection between this and reality? Well, when I got to the astrobiology center like 1 year and a half ago, I started to ask people if they thought that this could be connected to some of their models. And we found out that the interstellar medium is the place where we had to look at. Why? Because in the molecular clouds, we have a very complex structure with different physical regimes. When the molecular clouds start to collapse, the amount of dust grows, and therefore the extinction of the external interstellar UV ultraviolet radiation starts to grow. That is, in the beginning, the ultraviolet is able to get into the cloud, and it destroys most molecules that are created. But when it gets smaller and smaller, in one moment, we also have a transition because the dust is able to attenuate the radiation, and so these small molecules that have been created suddenly are able to interact, and so a very, very diverse, a large diversity of molecules appear, up to 200 or 250 in some cases. So let's try to compare our predictions with these real molecular clouds. To the right here in B, we have these abundance ranks for 4 different betas for those different environments. Okay, actually this brown line is this critical system. Okay, this black one is a very harsh system where there are only like 12 or 13 different structures. You have here the critical limit, and if you cross it, then we can have 40, 60, or even more different networks that interact. Great. In reality, we have looked at 4 different molecular clouds, and we have painted the abundance of the molecules that have been detected with radioastronomical techniques. And we see that, at least qualitatively, are quite similar. We also have some, for example, these few molecular clouds. We have some of them where there are very little molecules, but some of them, like TMC1, which is a very, very famous one, have more than 60 different molecules. And it seems that, at least qualitatively, things goes nicely. Actually, if we compare some cases, they can even surprisingly quantitatively fit quite well. Of course, not all of them, but still, I mean, taking into account that our system has nothing to do with chemistry, it's quite surprising that even the functional relationship of the curves are quite similar. Anyway, this is not all. And actually, something that I really like of molecules, and don't worry that I'm finishing now. I really like of models is that sometimes, even if models are very simple, and I really like simple models, sometimes models tell you where to look. Perhaps models are not describing very precisely reality, but they might give you some hints of what you have to look for. In this sense, here in F, what we found in our model is the abundance of the different networks that appear in NetWorld is proportional, or follows this function of is proportional to the number of paths that give rise to each of the networks. That is, if one network in my system can be created through 5 different paths in 5 different ways, this one is very probable that it will be more abundant than another network that can only be created through one path. Okay, so I said, I went to the astrochemists and I said, is there a way to measure the different chemical paths that give rise to the basic molecules that you detect, such as, water, H2, CO, CO2, ammonia, all those? And they said, actually, that's very complex, but there is a database called KITA where you can have how many different reactions have each molecule as a product. So you can say, how many reactions in astrochemistry give rise to water? And they say 154, for example. It's an example. And so I said, great, let's calculate that. And once again, very surprisingly, we found a relationship that had never been seen in astrochemistry, because no astrochemists had ever looked at this from this point of view. If you find the abundance, the real abundance of the different molecules that can be found in molecular clouds, depending on the number of reactions that give rise to each of them, actually, not the number of reactions that give rise to them in that molecular cloud, but in any part of the space, we have that the relationship is the same And actually, this alpha, in our case, is 1.2. And for these two different molecular clouds, is 1.1 and 1.2. So they are surprisingly similar. So just to finish, in conclusions, our work, not only this one, but in general, and I'm sure that Sarah Walker agrees with us, our work supports the idea that many properties that work in this very long way from chemistry to in space to prebiotic chemistry on Earth and from prebiotic chemistry to life might show quite simple and general patterns that can be understood with simple models. And in summary, the applicability of complexity theory to astrobiology is still starting. So this is more or less what I wanted to tell you.